10 lashes. She made no sound. They tied her to the post and called her nothing. But the silence carried farther than any scream, a wolf kingdom built on buried truth. 6 healers dead of fever. A ruthless AlphaKing draws blood iron from the stone where she bled. 1 ancient pack law. 1 stolen journal that names the dead. He cut her ropes with his own knife before he knew her name. She didn't cry, she rose. And the king saw, in the broken girl, a face his blood already knew, burning loyalties, howls in the dark, a traitor at the throne's right hand. Forged crowns, silver blades, a king losing control. They were all so certain they had broken her. She knelt as nothing. She was the highest blood in the kingdom the entire time. There's a sound a man learns to fear after enough years of living. It isn't the loud kind. It isn't thunder, or the snap of a branch on a dark road behind you. The sound that should scare you most is the one that stops. The scream that ends too early. Because a scream means a person is still fighting, still reaching for the world, still believing the world might reach back. And the quiet that comes after means they've given that up. I've been telling stories a long time now, long enough to have white in my beard and a bad knee that tells me when the weather's turning. And of all the stories that ever came across my path, this is the one I keep coming back to. The one about a girl who went silent, and the king who heard her do it from half a mountain away. His name was Garrick, 38 years old that autumn, and already 9 years king of the 7 packs. He'd ruled long enough to know the difference between a settlement gone quiet for the night and a settlement holding its breath. What rose up out of the valley below his ridge that evening was the second kind. The wrong kind. The kind that lifted the fur along his spine even while he stood there in human shape, in the cold breathing pine and the iron promise of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Something alive was hurting down there, and then it quit telling anyone about it. That should have eased him. It did the opposite. Garrick had heard that exact flavor of silence one other time in his life, a long while back, and he'd spent the years since hoping he never would again. So he stood his horse on that ridge, and he listened to a quiet that was louder than any howl, and something old in his chest woke up and refused to be talked back to sleep. But to understand the silence, you have to understand the girl. And to understand the girl, you have to come down off that ridge with me, into the courtyard of Hollow Pine, where a 22-year-old woman was on her knees in the dark, counting stars so she wouldn't count something worse. Her name was Maren, an Omega, which in a pack like Hollow Pine meant the bottom of every list and the first to be blamed when something went wrong. She'd lived 6 years under that roof, and in those 6 years she had made an art of being unseen. Have you ever held still while somebody hurt you? Held still on purpose, made your face go to stone, so they couldn't have the one thing they wanted from you? If you have, then you already understand Maren better than most of the pack that watched her bleed that night. Stay with me, because this is the story of how a silence brought a king down off a mountain, and it starts with a whip. The first lash took her voice. Not all at once. The first one tore a scream out of her so raw it scraped on the way up, like a blade dragged over stone. She heard it climb the courtyard walls, and underneath the pain, some small stubborn part of her thought, someone will hear that. Someone has to come. Nobody came. The second lash stole her breath. The third took what little balance she had left, kneeling there with her wrists roped to the post. By the 5th, she'd lost the count. By the 8th, she'd lost whole sentences, her mind reduced to single words drifting up out of dark water. Cold, stone, stop, please. The kind of words a person doesn't choose. The kind that just surface on their own. They'd torn the back of her dress to the waist. The autumn air came down off the Ashvin foothills with an edge to it, carrying pine resin and the wood smoke of the pack hall, where the rest of them sat warm and fed and chewing while she knelt out in it. And there she was, the reckoning stake against her spine, 300 years of iron driven into stone, a post built for rogues and traitors and killers. She was none of those things. She was the daughter of a dead woman who had known too much, and her only true crime was being that woman's child. The rest was paperwork. Pack law read out loud like the words made it just. Count them. The order came soft. That was the cruelest thing about the man who gave it. AlphaKing never raised his voice, not once in the 6 years Maren had lived under him. He didn't have to. His calm did the work that shouting does for smaller men. It was the calm of someone trimming a hedge, patient and exact and entirely without mercy. Then a second voice, a woman's, sweet the way something gone bad is sweet. That's 9. One more and we reach the pack law minimum for insubordination. That was Sela, Vorn's right hand. Maren couldn't see her face, but she didn't need to. She'd long ago memorized the sound of that smile. It lived in the woman's voice like a knife sewn into the lining of a glove. One more, Vorn agreed. Maren pressed her forehead to the iron. The cold went straight through bone and into her skull, and she tried to crawl inside it, tried to make herself small enough to disappear into the metal. The leather sang through the air, and something inside her simply stopped. Her heart kept on, her lungs kept on. But the other thing stopped, the part that begged, the part that still half believed the hall doors would bang open, and someone would run out shouting that this was wrong. That part went dark and stayed dark. The 10th lash landed. She felt every inch of it travel through her body, and she made no sound. Not a gasp, not a whimper, not one breath that wasn't perfectly, deliberately, almost spitefully controlled. Then silence. And the silence changed the courtyard. She heard Sela shift, uneasy. Heard the younger guard, the boy who always studied his own boots when Vorn gave an order, take a step back. Like the quiet had a hand and it had pushed him. She's passed out, someone muttered. She hasn't, Vorn answered, and there was something new under his voice. Not concern, the man owned none. Something closer to the unease of a craftsman who struck a knot in the grain. She's still breathing. Should we? The guard started. Leave her, Vorn said, until morning. Let her think on what it means to question me in front of the pack. Footsteps crossed the stone and went away. The hall doors swung open and a wedge of warmth and laughter spilled out, someone in the middle of a joke, a cup banging down on a table. Then the doors shut and took it all with them, and Maren was alone with the sky. The stars over Hollowpine burned hard that night. She could see them if she tipped her head a certain way against the post. So far off they made her feel like the only warm thing for a mile in any direction, which she very nearly was. She counted them the way she'd counted the lashes, 1 and 2 and 3, putting numbers between herself and the fire spreading across her back. Somewhere out past the walls, a wolf howled. It wasn't one of theirs. She knew the voice of every wolf in Hollowpine, and this one belonged to none of them. It ran deeper, older. A note she felt in her ribs before it ever reached her ears, rolling through the trees like slow weather. And for one strange, swimming second, she felt it reach the courtyard and settle over her like a hand laid gentle on the back of her neck. She had no way to know what it meant. She didn't know the howl came off a far ridge, from a wolf 3 days on the road who'd stopped because the wind had brought him something wrong. She didn't know a king had heard her go silent, or that a silence could carry farther than a scream, or that someone up there in the dark had understood the precise moment a person stops hoping. She knew the stars, the cold, the slow, careful work of breathing without a sound, because they had taken nearly everything, but they hadn't taken this. If she stayed quiet, they wouldn't know she was still fighting. And fighting where they couldn't see was the only weapon she had left. Her mother had died protecting a truth that could split this pack straight down its center. And kneeling there, bleeding onto stone older than anyone's grandfather, Maren made herself a promise. She was going to dig that truth back up, even if the digging put her in the ground beside it. Up on the ridge, a pair of gold eyes had gone very, very still. She had not always knelt. I want that said plainly, because the people who only ever saw her on her knees built a whole story around it, and that story was a lie from the first word. There was a time before, a time she ran these same woods with her shoes in her hand, and her hair loose down her back, and nothing in the whole world telling her she was worth less than anyone breathing. That time ended the night her mother died, Iona. That was her name, the quietest, powerful person Maren ever knew, and I've thought a great deal about that phrase over the years, because most of us confuse power with noise. Iona's power lived in her stillness, in the way she listened, like listening cost her nothing and meant everything at once. She'd walk into a room thick with fear and leave it calmer than she found it, and no one could ever quite say how she'd done it. She was the pack healer, had been since before Maren drew her first breath. The work gave her a key to everything. Every birth in the dead of night. Every wound carried through her door by men too proud to admit how they'd gotten it. Every shamed confession from a soul who couldn't say the words in daylight. She kept it all in a leather journal with a brass clasp, worn on a cord around her neck. She wore it sleeping. She wore it the way other women wore a wedding band. Maren asked her once why she never took it off. Iona gave her that smile, the warm one with something careful tucked behind it. Some truths are too dangerous to leave lying around, little bird. Maren was 16 when they buried her. Fever, they said. Quick and brutal, the kind that takes the old and the weak and, every so often terribly, one in her prime. The pack healer, dead of a fever. The irony of it was thick enough to chew. And Maren stood at the graveside and watched the faces in the crowd, and she saw the thing none of them seemed to see. No one looked at Vorn and then looked away too fast. No one's eyes did the guilty little jump. And no one but Maren noticed what was missing. The journal was gone. Iona had worn it every single day of her daughter's life, and they laid her in the ground without it. A shattered 16-year-old, alone, with the world having eaten the last of her family, does the only thing left to do. She survives. Maren made herself small. She learned which floorboards in the hall groaned and which held their tongues. She learned which guard took which gate at which hour. She learned to stand in the corner of a room in such a way that the eyes slid right off her, the way water slides off oiled wood. Bria taught her the rest. Bria found her 3 days after the burial, crouched behind the woodpile at the edge of the grounds, gnawing the heel of a loaf she'd lifted from the kitchen before anyone else woke. Maren hadn't slept in 2 days. She looked, by her own account, like something the forest had chewed and spat back out. Bria sat down beside her without asking permission, and for a full 5 minutes she said nothing at all. Then she dug a strip of dried venison from her coat and set it on Maren's knee. "You're Iona's daughter." "Yes. I'm sorry about your mother." Maren said nothing to that. "I'm Bria. My father's a border guard, and he's about as useful as a chair, but he keeps a warm fire and he forgets I exist most days, which means the cottage is more or less mine. You could sleep there. Floor was hard. No splinters, though." Maren looked at her then for the first time, really looked. A year older, dark eyes. A small white scar on the chin from a childhood spill off a fence, though Maren wouldn't learn that for a while yet. And the girl was looking back with an expression Maren hadn't seen on a single face in 3 days. Not pity, just an offer, held out plain. "Okay," Maren said. That was the start of the only friendship that ever truly saved her life. And before this story is done, it will try to save it more than once. Bria never pushed about the journal. Never made Maren talk about Iona before she was ready to. But she watched. She caught things other people walked straight past. And as the years went by and Vorn's grip on Hollowpine drew tighter, as the whole settlement grew heavier and stranger to live in, it was Bria who kept Maren from vanishing altogether, the way a person can vanish while still drawing breath. The first real thread came 4 years after the burial. By accident, the way most important things arrive, Maren was cleaning the upper storage room, a job handed to Omegas, because nobody else would touch it, when a loose board shifted under her foot and showed a hollow beneath. A folded square of paper waited in it. The handwriting on it was her mother's, and Maren's hands shook so badly she could hardly open the thing. The paper was soft at the creases, old, and the words ran in the shorthand cipher Iona had used for her private medical notes. A code she'd taught her daughter as a child, calling it a game. She thought it was a game. Maren remembered standing there thinking, in the dust and the thin storage light, but she was already hiding things. Already getting me ready. She decoded it on her feet, her heart slamming against her ribs. A list of names, 7 of them. A date beside each. A single word beside each date. 6 of the words were the same. Silenced. The 7th name she knew in her bones, Iona. The date beside it sat 2 weeks ahead of the day the note was written, and the word beside that date was different from all the rest. Warned. Her mother had known. Had known they were coming. Had hidden this, and somehow through all the grief and fear and bare survival, Maren hadn't found it until now. She folded the paper with hands that had gone strangely, perfectly steady, and tucked it against her skin under her shirt, and finished the room. That night, by Bria's fire, she laid it open between them. They sat with it a long time before either spoke. The fire spat and settled. Maren, whatever this is, whatever your mother found out, Vorn killed 6 people to keep it buried. I know, and he'd have made it 7. Except she died before he got the chance. Or she let him believe she died, Maren said, very quiet. Before he got the chance. Bria only stared at her. Outside, the woods pressed dark and close against the cottage walls, full of things no one in Hollowpine had yet dared say out loud. Knowing Vorn was a murderer was one thing. Living inside his pack the next morning, laying out his breakfast with your eyes down and your face wiped blank, that was the thing that ate a person from the inside. Maren had been doing it 6 years by the time she found that note. 6 years learning the strange geometry of staying alive in a place run by a man who looked at people the way a gambler looks at pieces on a board. It's the small cruelties that do the real damage. Everyone talks about the big ones, the beatings, the post, the wounds you can point to. But the big ones at least announce themselves. It's the small ones that hollow you out, the ones that leave no mark to show anybody. The way Vorn looked at her now and then, not with hatred. Hatred she could have used, could have braced against, could have warmed her hands at. He looked at her instead, like she was a figure in a sum he hadn't finished working, a number not yet placed. The way Sella found reasons to move her to worse labor the moment she'd found a rhythm, just as Maren learned the kitchen's hours and carved out a little patch of the predictable, Sela would drift over with that soft smile and a fresh assignment. The waste pits, the animal pens in the deep of winter, the outer fence in the rain, never named as punishment. Officially, Maren had done nothing wrong. Officially, she was a cooperative Omega doing her work, quiet and efficient and easy to overlook. That overlooking was the armor she put on every single morning. Bria wore a different armor entirely, a brightness that read from the outside as nothing but warmth. She laughed easily. She spoke to the guards like they were men, and not fixtures bolted to the wall. She carried food to the old ones who could no longer make the walk to the hall. Everybody liked Bria, and because everybody liked her, she moved through Hollowpine more freely than nearly anyone of their rank. She spent that freedom on Maren, without ever once being asked to. It was Bria who knew which nights Vorn's study sat empty. Bria who'd clocked the locked chest beneath the laundry floor. And it was Bria who befriended old Aldous, out at the eastern edge of the grounds, 81 years old, a man who had kept the pack's records under 3 alphas before Vorn. His memory ran like a river, deep and clear, carrying things down from a long way upstream. He knew your mother, Bria told her one evening. They were wedged into the gap between the woodpile and the hall wall, the old hiding place they'd never quite outgrown. He won't say her name straight out, but when I do, he gets a look. What kind of look? Like he's working a sum in his head. Like he knows more than he lets on, and he's deciding whether I'm safe to hand it to. Has he decided? I think he's deciding about you, Maren, not me. He keeps asking what you're like, whether you're careful. Something pulled tight in Maren's chest at that. The careful kind of hope, the kind that belongs to people who have waited a very long time for a single door to open. When can I meet him? Maren asked soon. But careful, Maren. Vorn watches him too. Not closely, the old man reads as harmless, just another graybeard waiting out his last winters. But Vorn watches everything, and that was the truth of the man, not simply cruel. Cruelty on its own is wasteful, and Vorn never wasted a thing. He was strategic, and every move he made in Hollowpine fed some larger pattern only he could see entire. The public punishments weren't justice, and were never meant to be. They were lessons. Messages written on a person's back for the whole pack to read. Which is exactly why, when the firewood business happened 3 weeks after Maren found the note, she understood at once what it really was. It began over a woodpile. An older Omega named Doran, a quiet man with a bad knee from a break that had never set right, drew the job of splitting the winter cords. Heavy work for anyone. For a man with a ruined knee in the first hard cold of the season, it was a slow torture. He worked the whole morning through and met the quota by midday, which, by any honest reckoning, meant the task was done. Vorn said he'd stacked it wrong, not dangerously wrong. Not in any way that would ever matter to a single soul. The angle of the cords sat slightly off, true. which Vorn noted before the full evening assembly, in that quiet, exact voice of his, as proof of sloppiness, proof of an Omega who'd decided good enough would do when in fact it fell short of the mark. Doran apologized with his eyes on the floor, the way they'd all been trained to. Vorn accepted the apology the way a cat accepts a mouse that has stopped struggling, with total composure and no mercy whatsoever. Then he assigned Doran to restack the entire pile. That night, alone, in the dark, on that knee, Maren watched from the kitchen window. Doran worked 4 hours, and she stood there turning the list over in her mind. 6 names, 6 people silenced, and the question she'd been circling for weeks now, the way a half-frozen wolf circles a fire, hungry for the warmth and afraid of the burn. What had they all known? What truth was heavy enough that 6 people had to die to sink it? And then the other question, the personal one, the one with teeth. How long before Vorn decides I've learned too much? The answer came faster than she'd braced for. 10 days. She was called before the assembly. The charge was insubordination. The evidence was a moment 2 weeks prior when she'd questioned Vorn's decision to cut the Omega rations for the 3rd month running. She hadn't said it loudly. She hadn't said it in public. She'd said it low, to Selah in the kitchen, that some of the older Omegas were already showing the slack gray look of going without, and that perhaps the medical standards deserved a second look. Selah had smiled the velvet and blade smile and said nothing at all. 2 weeks later, before the assembly, she repeated every word of it, precise as a surgeon, and Vorn listened and weighed and arrived at his number, 10 lashes. Bound to the stake, walking out to the courtyard, Maren passed Bria in the doorway. The girl had gone the color of cold ash, her hands pressed flat against her own sides, the way she held herself when she was forcing her body not to do something that would get her hurt as well. Maren caught her eyes and put the word into the look. Don't speak, don't move, stay safe. And Bria understood the way only Bria ever could, swallowing a grief so whole that no one watching would have known it was there. So Maren walked out. She knelt. The stars came out cold and bright and impossibly far. And she heard her mother's voice across the years. Some truths are too dangerous to leave lying around. And she thought, I am still here. I am still breathing. And whatever you buried, Mama, I am going to find it. Then the first lash fell, and we are back where this began. A girl going quiet on purpose. And a king on a ridge who heard her do it. He had never meant to come this way at all. Garrick's route through the Eastern Territories had been laid out months in advance by Cassius. His is Beta, a man who approached a travel schedule the way some men approach scripture. Stops marked, rest points fixed. Pack visits cleared through the proper channels, with the proper notice given. Hollowpine had not been anywhere on the map. Garrick had cut off the planned road on the second night of riding, somewhere in the deep timber between the Ashvin slopes and the Coldwater Basin, when the wind shifted and carried him something. His wolf, old and driven by instincts his human mind couldn't always put to words, had simply turned northwest, off the line entirely. Cassius noticed inside a heartbeat. That's not east. No, Garrick agreed. The next scheduled stop is the Maren settlement. They're expecting us by nightfall tomorrow. Shay word. We'll be delayed. Cassius studied him with the particular look he saved. For the moments his king did something that made no strategic sense. 12 years as a beta had taught him to tell the difference between Garrick acting on bad judgment and Garrick acting on something that ran deeper than judgment could reach. He sent the word. They rode northwest. Garrick offered no explanation, partly because he couldn't have given one that would satisfy a mind like Cassius's, and partly because he was still working the thing out himself. The pull. The wrongness threaded through the wind. A note that sat just under hearing and just over feeling, humming in the narrow space between the two. Something alive was hurting off in that direction, and his blood had decided they were going toward it. He'd felt this twice before in his life. Once at 19, once at 32. Both times, it had carried him to a place that needed a hand no one else had thought to offer. He was 38 now, and the long years between those 2 nights had taught him not to argue with the pull, only to follow it with his eyes wide open. They reached the ridge above Hollowpine just before full dark. From up there, the settlement looked like nothing at all. Firelight in the hall windows. cook smoke rising straight in the still air. The low, ordinary sounds of an evening, a far voice, a dog barking at some shadow only it could see, and then, for one moment, a sound that did not belong, a human voice in pain, a woman's, rising from the open courtyard at the heart of the place. Cassius heard it too. He went still. That's a punishment post. He knew it by the acoustics, the way sound bent off stone laid in a certain arrangement. Yes, Garrick said, pack law allows. I know what pack law allows. They held their horses on the ridge while it went on below them. Garrick counted under his breath, his jaw set hard. Beside him, Cassius held the expression of a man keeping his composure through real effort. After the 7th cry, Garrick had nudged his horse a step down the slope. After the 8th, Cassius laid a hand on his arm. Protocol says we don't step into a pack's internal discipline unless… Protocol says a great many things, Garrick answered, quietly, and Cassius had long ago learned to hear that particular quiet as more dangerous than any shout. After the 9th, they were halfway down the ridge, and then came the silence. Not the silence of a thing being finished, nor the silence of someone walking away satisfied. A different silence altogether. The silence of a person who has made some decision deep down inside themselves. A door easing shut, a lamp going out room by room. The silence of someone when choosing to stop handing the world the gift of their own voice. Garrick stopped his horse cold. There it was, the thing he'd heard once before and prayed never to hear again. Climbing up out of that valley with cold fingers, reaching past 9 years of careful rule, to lay itself against the thing in his chest. He kept locked away for good reason. What is that? Cassius asked, barely a breath. Garrick didn't answer for a long moment. That, he said at last, is someone deciding whether to survive. He watched the courtyard. The distance and the dark gave his wolf sight only shapes to work with. The post. The bound figure slumped against it. The little knot of people walking back toward the warmth, leaving her out there alone in the cold, still breathing, still present, but gone somewhere down inside herself to a place they had driven her. Deciding, something moved in Garrick that he had no clean name for. 9 years he had ruled the 7 packs. He'd sat across the table from alphas, who played long political games and called it governance. He'd watched power wielded with wisdom and power wielded like a whip, and he had given the whole of his grown life to building something better than what he'd inherited. A kingdom of packs that did ask its lowest members to bleed so its highest ones could sit warm. In all 9 of those years, Hollowpine had never once flagged. Vorn's reports arrived on time. His tribute came in correct to the coin, his borders held. On paper, the place was a functional, forgettable, middle-rank pack out in the eastern timber. And looking down at the figure roped to that post, Garrick understood that someone had worked very hard to make her forgettable too. On paper. Probably. We're going down, he said. Tonight? And unannounced, not tonight. And there was a new thing in his voice now, cold and deliberate and patient. Tonight I want Vorn to believe no one is watching. Tonight I want to say exactly what this place does when it thinks the only eyes on it are its own. Cassius caught the shape of it at once. Reconnaissance. We watch. We don't let ourselves be seen. And her, Cassius added. Garrick's gold eyes stayed fixed on the still shape below. On the faint rise and fall, he could just make out because he was hunting for it, because he needed to know it was still happening. Tomorrow morning, he said, we ride into Hollowpine as the AlphaKing on an unscheduled inspection. Full protocol. Full authority. And if Vorn has already, if she isn't alive and standing come morning, then Vorn answers to me directly, Garrick said, and I will not be using protocol. Cassius looked at him a long moment, then nodded once. Slow. Below, the stars threw their light back off the stone, and the girl at the post tipped her head as though she were counting them. Garrick stayed where he was until her breathing changed, until it slowed and deepened, and he understood she'd found some rough form of sleep, and that the cold would not take her before dawn. He did not fully understand why it mattered to him this much. Not yet. But his wolf understood. His wolf had understood from the first second it heard her go quiet. And here is the part none of them knew that night. Not the king on the ridge. Not the beta beside him. Not even the girl on the stone, with her mother's note hidden against her heart. The pull that had turned Garrick off his road. the wrongness in the wind that no map could ever mark. It wasn't pity and it wasn't chance. It was something older than both. Something carried in the blood, which recognizes its own, long before the mind has the first idea what it's looking at. I've turned that over many nights since. How a man can be drawn across a country by a tie he doesn't yet know he has. How the body sometimes knows the truth years ahead of the head. Up on that ridge, with frost beginning to silver the grass and a king deciding to wait until morning, the first thread of a long-buried truth had just been picked up by the one pair of hands in the world powerful enough to pull it all the way loose. Maren had no idea. She knew only the cold and the stars, and a promise made on her knees that she fully intended to keep. She woke to frost on her eyelashes. The night had worked its way into her bones the way cold always does when it's given hours and nothing to stop it. Slowly, deeply, becoming part of the body's frame rather than just a thing on the skin. Her wrists, still roped to the iron, had gone past hurting into a thick dead numbness. Her back was another country entirely. Her back was a field on fire. She didn't move. 6 years of small survivals had taught her the first few seconds of waking were the ones that mattered most. Before you stir, before you make a sound, you listen. You take inventory. You learn the rules of this particular morning. Courtyard, stone, alone. The hour before dawn, the sky over the walls was the color of a deep bruise just beginning to pale at its edges. The hall sat quiet. The night guards had rotated an hour back. She could tell from the change in the footstep patterns she tracked, even half-conscious. The boot-watching boy was on the far gate now. The eastern wall had no one at all. She was running the math on her own wrists. Old leather gone soft in the cold, maybe loose enough if she rolled her hands the way Bria had shown her years ago, when she heard the thing that stopped every thought dead. Horses, not pack horses. She knew the rhythm of the Holopine stables the way she knew her own pulse, and these were wrong. Several animals moving steady up the main road, trained well. Expensive. The kind of horse a person owns when they hold authority over everyone in a place, Vorn included. The night guard's voice cracked across the dark, sharp with sudden fright. Halt. Identify. A second voice answered, calm and certain. Cassius. Beta to the AlphaKing, Garrick of the 7 packs. Stand aside. The courtyard held its breath. The gates groaned open. Then the footsteps came, several sets, disciplined and measured, pouring through into the grounds. She heard guards scrambling to wake the hall, heard voices inside climbing up out of sleep, slow to alarm. Heard Vorn's voice, stripped for once of its careful calm, clipped and bare. What hour is it? Why was there no notice? Who authorized? The AlphaKing authorizes his own movements, Cassius said. He will speak with Alpha Vorn in the hall within the hour. Have it ready. And then a different set of steps. Slower. Singular. A man who moved like he had never once in his life had any reason to hurry, because the world simply rearranged itself around the fact of his arriving. The steps stopped at the mouth of the courtyard. Maren didn't look. Forehead to the post, eyes down, breath even. Every instinct she owned told her to stay still, to be the shape in the corner, the woman-shaped absence, to not be seen, except she felt it anyway. The way you feel a fire on the back of your neck when you've turned away from it. The warmth of being looked at by something old, something paying close attention, something that saw clearly even in the dark. What is this? Not a question, a verdict waiting on an answer. The boot-watching boy stammered somewhere behind her. She a punishment, sir, per Alpha Vorn's order. The charge was insubordination. Insubordination. How long has she been out here? Since last evening, sir. Around silence. Then the slow steps crossed the stones and stopped at her back. She felt the air shift. A knife went through the leather at her wrists in 2 clean strokes, and her arms dropped forward, and the blood came roaring back into her hands like a second beating, which she swallowed whole without a sound. She caught herself against the post before she could fall. She would not fall in front of strangers. Slowly, using the iron as a crutch, she turned. The man before her was tall the way a ridge is tall, not imposing through any effort, simply through the plain fact of his own size and stillness. Dark hair cropped close. A face that wasn't soft and hadn't been for a long time, but wasn't cruel either. A face that kept its reactions just behind the eyes, where they could be examined before they were ever let out. And the eyes themselves were gold, Not amber, not hazel. Gold, like late autumn light coming through old glass. Like a fire that had been burning low and steady for a very long time. They were on her with a look she couldn't sort. She'd braced for assessment, the cold arithmetic she saw in Vorn's eyes. Or for pity, the wet, useless kind that feels sorry about suffering. Only so long as the suffering stays far enough off to demand nothing. It was neither of those. It was closer to recognition. A man opening a door in a house he has never set foot in, and finding inside it a room whose shape he somehow already knows by heart. "Can you stand?" "I'm standing." Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Something flickered across his face, quick, gone before she could read it. "What's your name?" "Maren." Behind him the hall doors had opened, and Vorn appeared at the top of the steps, dressed and composed within the 4 minutes he'd been given. She had to grant him that much. The man could become whichever version of himself a moment called for, and become it fast, and the becoming was very nearly an art. Smooth, controlled, radiating the polite welcome of an alpha receiving a visit he hadn't expected but was entirely prepared to host. "AlphaKing," a smooth bow of the head. "We are honored. Forgive the hour. Had we received notice?" "Maren?" Garrick didn't look away from her. "Go inside. Find warmth. She is an Omega assigned to." "I am not speaking to you yet." His voice never rose. It didn't need to. It simply cut clean across Vorn's words the way a blade cuts a rope. No wasted motion in it anywhere. Vorn went quiet, and Maren looked at this king who had sawed through her bonds with his own knife in the gray dark of a courtyard he had no earthly reason to be standing in, and she made a choice. 6 years she had spent making herself impossible to see. Perhaps it was finally time to be seen. "Thank you," she said. Quiet. Then she walked past him, up the steps, into the warmth. Behind her she heard Garrick turn at last toward Vorn now. "We'll talk." She did not look back. But for the first time in 6 years she went through those doors not as an Omega, not as Iona's invisible girl, not as the small, quiet thing that lived by going unnoticed. She went through as someone a king had spoken to directly. And Vorn had been made to wait. The hall fire cracked and hissed. Bria came flying from the kitchen, her eyes huge, a blanket already in her hands, and wrapped it around Maren's shoulders and held on. "There's a king outside." "I know. He cut you loose himself." "I know." Bria pulled back and read her face with those dark eyes that never missed a thing. "Maren." "What is happening?" Maren looked toward the doors. Through the narrow gap where they hadn't fully shut, she could see the line of Vorn's shoulders, rigid, locked. For the first time in 6 years, the man looked as though he were no longer certain of his own safety. "And I'll tell you, of all the things Maren ever described to me about that morning, that's the one she lingered on. It was," she said, "the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. I think," she said slowly, "that everything is about to change." It did change, though not in the shape she expected, which is how these things tend to go. Garrick found her in the kitchen an hour later, after he had finished with Vorn behind a closed door, after Cassius had been turned loose on the pack records, with the focused appetite of a hound, handed a scent. The king came in, and the room grew smaller. Not from any menace, only from the fact of him filling it. She stood at the fire-warming hands that had only just remembered they were hers. Bria stood at her shoulder, watching the door like a woman who'd been watching doors her entire life. "Vorn has been told to reassign you to my staff for the length of my stay," Garrick said. "You're off-pack duties? For how long?" "As long as it takes." "It takes what?" Bria made a small sound that might have been a swallowed laugh. The king noted it without appearing to. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. "About Hollowpine. About what happens here. About your mother." The steadiness in Maren's gray eyes went careful, not afraid. The difference between those two things mattered a great deal. "You know about my mother. I know she was the pack healer. I know she died 6 years ago." A pause. "I know it was recorded as a fever." Something crossed Maren's face, fast and sharp. "You know something about her death." It wasn't a question. "I know that in the past 9 years, 4 pack healers across the Eastern Territories have died of fever within 6 months of a new alpha taking leadership. It's a pattern I began tracking 3 years ago. Hollowpine is one of those 4 packs." The kitchen went very still. The fire popped. Maren and Bria traded a look that carried an entire conversation in the space of 2 seconds. Then Maren turned back to him, and the wariness shifted into something cleaner. I have something to show you, something my mother left. She drew the folded paper from the neckline of her dress, old, soft at the creases, handled 1,000 times over, and laid it open on the table between them with hands that did not shake at all. He read the names, the dates, the words. She watched him recognize 3 of them on sight, watched his jaw set hard. You decoded this. She taught me the cipher when I was small. She told me it was a game. He looked at the paper, then at her. She was protecting you. She made certain you'd have the tools to survive what she knew was coming. Maren's chin lifted a single degree. Her eyes were bright. I know. I've known a long time. And here I have to be as honest with you as the story was eventually honest with Maren. 'Cause she believed, standing in that warm kitchen, that the worst of it lay behind her. She believed finding the note, and finding a man with the power to act on it, had been the hard part. It wasn't. The hard part was that the truth had more layers than her mother had been able to set down on paper. And every single one of those layers was going to cost somebody something. Cassius found the first crack at 11 that morning. He'd been working through the council logs in the small records room off the main hall, a space that smelled of old paper and tallow and the particular dusty weight of things kept and never once looked at again. Vorn had handed over the records with exact punctuality, stacked and labeled and correctly ordered, which was itself worth noting. A pack that keeps records this clean has a reason to feel confident in what they show, or a reason to feel confident in what they don't. 12 years of beta. Hundreds of pack archives as across 7 territories. Cassius knew the texture of honest disorder. The skipped meeting, the thin month, the year a scribe changed and the handwriting shifted with him. Real mess is organic. It varies. It's a little different every time you meet it. Hollow Pine's records were too clean for that. Not the clean of careful keeping. The clean of careful editing. Every 3rd month, across 7 years, a council meeting was logged with attendance recorded and no minutes beneath it. That alone wasn't unheard of. Packs hold verbal-only sessions for sensitive matters. But 7 years of them, every 3rd month, the same 3 names listed as present and no others. That isn't a habit. That's a pattern with a purpose. He went and found his king, in the kitchen of all places, seated across a table from the Omega and her friend with an old paper between them and a look on his face Cassius hadn't seen in a long while. The look that lived in the country between fury and focus. The state Garrick fell into when something had broken his sense of what was permitted. And he was deciding precisely what to do about it. The records, Cassius said, and then glanced at the 2 women. Speak. He laid it out. The gaps, the missing minutes. The 3 names that surfaced each and every time. Maren's hand slid forward across the table. Which 3 names? Cassius looked to Garrick. The king nodded once. Vorn. His second, a man called Pharaoh, and the council elder logged as Draven. Maren made a sound, low and sharp, like a bolt sliding home in a lock. Draven died 4 years ago. They said he fell, off the eastern watchtower. Her voice went flat and tightly controlled. He was the one who trained my mother. No one spoke for a moment. What was discussed in those meetings? Bria asked. Nothing officially, Cassius said. That's the whole point of them. They're logged as having happened. No content was ever set down. Garrick turned to Maren. You said your mother kept it around her neck. When they buried her, it was gone. Vorn has it. Not a question. He must, or Sella. And here Bria shifted in her seat. Just slightly. Just enough for Maren to catch it across the table. What Bria hesitated. One long breath. 3 months ago, I was doing the laundry in the lower hall. I saw Sella go into the locked storerooms below it, the ones that are supposed to hold winter provisions and nothing else. A pause she clearly didn't want to take. She was carrying something under her arm, wrapped in cloth, about this size? Maren held her hands a book's width apart. Silence. You didn't tell me, Maren said, very quiet. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't want to hand you a thing that would push you to do something that would get you. Bria stopped, pressed her lips white. I was trying to protect you. Maren reached across and touched her hand once, brief, then looked back at the king. The locked storerooms take 1 key. Vorn carries it on his person. There was a 2nd key, made for the old packmaster 20 years back. I don't know where it is. I do. said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Aldous stood there, 81 years old, small and bent as a winter tree. His eyes very sharp and very calm, a clay cup of something steaming in one hand. He looked over the gathered room with the expression of a man who had been waiting a long while for exactly this assembly to come together in exactly this way. "Sit down, old man," Garrick said, with a gentleness that surprised even Cassius. "Tell me what you know." Aldous settled into the chair at the end of the table, as though it had been set out for him hours ago. "I know a great deal," he said. "I have been waiting a very long time for someone with the authority to act on it." His eyes moved to Maren, and someone with the evidence to back it. He reached into his coat. "The second key to the storerooms has sat in my cottage for years, since not long after Iona came to us. She gave it to me for safekeeping, once she'd settled and decided I was a man who could keep a thing. He set it on the wood. It hasn't left my floorboards since." Maren stared at the iron. She planned this. Barely above a whisper. She planned for someone to find it eventually. All of it. The cipher, the note. "The key, your mother," Aldous said, "was the most deliberate person I ever knew, and I've known a great many in 81 years. She did nothing without a reason behind it. She understood she was in danger at least a year before she died. She spent that year making certain that if she fell, the truth could still be raised back up." Maren's eyes shone. She was not going to cry, the refusal of it plain across her face from one side of the table to the other. But the brightness sat there all the same. "She was protecting me. She was protecting everyone," Aldous said. "But yes, you most of all." He turned the cup slow in his hands. "I held my tongue 6 years, girl. 6 years I watched you scrub his floors and carry his slop and go gray around the edges, and I told myself it was wisdom to wait." He looked up, and there was an old grief in him. It wasn't wisdom. It was fear wearing wisdom's coat. "I'm an old man, and I'd grown fond of breathing. But I'm done waiting now. Whatever's left in me, it's yours." I've thought about that confession many times since. How long a frightened man can call his fear by a nobler name, and how it sometimes takes a stranger riding in from the cold to shame the courage back into the rest of us. Aldous had carried that key 18 years near enough. He'd carried his silence almost as long, and he laid both down on the same morning, because a king had refused to ride past a sound in the dark, and the refusing had given everyone else permission to stop being afraid. They would go in at midnight, not Maren. Garrick had been firm on that point, and Maren had been every bit as firm that she was going. They reached a compromise that held together only because Cassius gave the king a look that said, "This argument will outlast the night, just let her come along." So it was Cassius and Bria and Maren and 2 of Garrick's guards, silent and able men, moving through the lower hall in the dead dark while Vorn and Sella slept, and the night watch walked the outer line. The second key fit clean. The door swung in without a whisper. Well-oiled hinges, of course. Vorn maintained everything he owned, down to the locks on the rooms where he hid his sins. The chamber beyond was cold and smelled of earth and old stone. Cassius's small lamp threw a circle of yellow light that pushed the dark back just far enough to work by. Shelves of provisions, properly stocked, properly turned. And at the far end, behind a row of sealed clay jars, a wooden chest. Locked with a different lock than the door itself, Maren and Bria looked at each other and said nothing. Cassius pulled a leather roll from his coat, his tools, and bent to the chest with the quiet focus of a man who'd done this kind of thing before in his life and made no apologies for the skill. Maren stood still. The cold of the room was nothing to her after the post. She barely felt it. She was listening to the building above them, to footsteps that weren't there, to the silence that meant they were still undiscovered. And she was thinking of her mother walking these same halls every day for years, knowing what was buried here, holding that knowledge close, making the hard, long-sighted choices that would let it one day be dug back into the light. "I understand now," Maren thought. "Everything you did." "I finally understand," the lock gave. Cassius lifted the lid. To comics, a great many of them, scrolled and folded and stacked with Vorn's signature precision. Because even his hidden evidence the man kept tidy. And on the very top, wrapped in the same oilcloth Iona had always used to keep the damp off her medical notes, lay the journal. Maren lifted it out. The leather was exactly as she remembered, soft along the spine from years of daily handling, the brass clasp gone dull and tarnished now. She pressed it to her chest 1 full second with her eyes shut, and Bria laid a hand on her shoulder and said nothing at all, which was precisely right. Then she opened it, her mother's hand, page after page after page, medical notes, pack records, observations all in the coded shorthand, years of careful work, and woven all through it, in a different ink, a different urgency entirely, the secret record. Names, dates, pack resources redirected, tribute falsified, funds bleeding out of the pack's accounts and into private holdings Vorn controlled alone, not a little. Years of it, patient, systematic, enormous. And more than the money, the 6, their names, their roles, what each of them had known or threatened to say aloud, the dates they died and the manner of each. Fever, an accident, vanished on border patrol, ruled a wolf attack and buried before anyone could ask the wrong questions. And near the back, in plain language instead of cipher, a single page that did not match the rest. If you are reading this, then you were brave enough to find it. I am sorry I could not be there. I am sorry I could not tell you everything while I could still hold you. Maren, if it is you, know that I left this world fighting. Know what I have always known. Since the first moment I held you, you are not what they made you. You are not the name they gave you. You were never small. The truth is in your blood. It is in mine. And someday when the right person is there to hear it, tell them who you really are.
She read the last line twice.
Then she looked up at Cassius, who was watching her with the carefully neutral face he wore when something was reaching him. And he hadn't yet decided whether to let it through. Tell me, she said. What does it mean? Tell them who you really are. Cassius looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the thing that bent the whole night sideways. Garrick needs to see this. Tonight. All of it. Now. Why? Bria asked. Cassius's expression did something complicated and difficult to watch, because better than 20 years ago, the AlphaKing's family, the ruling line of the 7 packs, kept a healer. A healer who served the royal pack itself. He paused. Her name was Iona. The cold room went perfectly, completely still. She left the royal pack. Cassius went on, his voice low. There was a situation, a political one. The kind that puts a person in danger they did nothing to earn. She was helped to disappear, given a placement in a distant pack where no one would think to look for her. He looked at Maren, his eyes level and steady. She was already carrying a child when she left. The lamplight wavered. Brad's breath caught beside her. Maren did not move. She couldn't. What are you saying? Her voice belonged to some other woman entirely. Cassius looked at the journal in her hands, at the letter, at the last line written there. Your mother's name before she came to Hollowpine, he said, was Iona of the royal house. She was bonded to. He stopped, plainly weighing the size of the words coming next. She was bonded to the AlphaKing's elder brother, who died before Garrick ever took the throne. The silence stretched like ice forming over deep water. Which means, Maren said, hearing her own voice from a great and ringing distance, that I am. You are blood of the royal line. By lineage, you hold the highest rank in all 7 packs. She looked down at her hands. The hands of a woman who had scrubbed floors for 6 years, whose wrists had been roped to a post a day and a half ago, whose back still burned beneath the bandages Bria had wound that very morning. Behind her, Bria made a sound that was not a word. Garrick, Maren said finally. He knows, Cassius shook his head. He doesn't know you exist. Your mother's disappearance was kept secret. Even from him, his own brother's bond hidden away by men who claimed to be acting in the family's interest. A pause. But now I think I understand why he came here. The instinct that pulled him off his road in this direction. He stopped, looked at her steadily. Blood knows blood. Even when the mind has no idea yet what it's recognizing. She closed the journal, held it against her chest, and thought of a king on a ridge in the dark, cutting a stranger's ropes with his own knife before he had even learned her name. But the night was not finished handing out its weights. Because as Cassius reached past her to begin sorting the rest of the chest, his lamp slid across a thin packet of letters bound in cord at the very bottom, and the wax seal pressed into the topmost one was not Vorn's. It was a seal Cassius knew far too well. His face changed. He went still in a way that had nothing whatever to do with the cold of the room. What? Maren said. What is it? This seal, Cassius said slowly, belongs to a member of the royal council. He lifted the packet into the lamplight, and his hand was not entirely steady. Which means Vorn was never running this alone. It means someone close to Garrick, someone trusted, someone who has sat in his chambers and eaten at his table. He stopped, has been feeding Hollowpine for years. He looked up. And if these letters say what I believe they say, then the king did not simply ride into a corrupt pack. He rode into a trap that has been waiting 9 years to spring. The candle guttered. Above them in the hall, a floorboard settled with a soft groan. And Maren stood there holding her dead mother's journal in one hand and her whole rearranged life in the other. And she understood, with the cold clarity of water poured straight down the spine, that the most dangerous man in this story was not Vorn at all. He was somewhere far to the north, seated at the king's right hand, waiting. She brought the journal to Garrick's door before the night was through. He opened it on the first knock. Like he hadn't been sleeping, like he'd been sitting up in the lamplight, waiting for the world to hand him something heavy. His gold eyes went to the book in her hands, then to her face, then to the cord-bound packet Cassius held just behind her shoulder. "There's something you need to know," she said. He stepped back to let them in. And over the next 3 hours, in a room that smelled of cold candle wax and an older grief, the whole architecture of a long lie came apart on a wooden table. She gave him everything, the names, the dates, the years of small observations that each looked like nothing on their own, and together formed a noose. Cassius laid the royal council seal beneath the lamp. And Garrick studied it a long time without speaking, and Maren watched a man learn that the rot he had ridden out here to cut from somebody else's house had been quietly spreading through his own all along. "Ho," he said at last. Cassius hesitated. "The seal belongs to Councillor Renauld." Something in Garrick's face went to stone. "Renauld sat on the council that hid your mother's disappearance," he said slowly, almost to himself. "Renauld signed the order that placed her here." He looked up, and the gold of his eyes had gone hard and bright as struck metal. "He didn't hide her to keep her safe. He hid her to bury her somewhere no one would ever think to look." And then the last weight dropped, because Cassius told him the rest. The lineage, the brother, the child who had left in a dead woman's belly and grown up scrubbing floors in the very pack a royal councillor had chosen, precisely because it was run by a man who would kill anyone who learned too much. Garrick went very still. Not the managed stillness Maren had watched him use on Vorn. The real kind. The kind a man falls into when the ground he has stood on for years tips a few degrees and never quite tips back level again. "She never told you," he said to Maren. "Not a question. No, she was protecting you." His voice was quiet. "From what I understand of it, a girl known as Royal Blood in a place like this, under a man like Vorn, would have been a knife somebody held to my throat, or a knife somebody buried in the dark. Either way, not safe. Not for one single day of her life. No," Maren agreed. "She wouldn't have been. They sat with it, and then the king did thing Maren had no slot to file it under. You are owed an apology," he said. "From the royal line, for not knowing, for not protecting you, for the men who wore my family's seal and used it to cover a murder. You didn't know I existed. No. But my family's failures don't stop being failures because I inherited them blind." He held her gaze across the table. "The debt is real whether I knew the ledger of it or not. And I mean to pay it." She didn't know what to do with that. With a man who held 7 territories in the palm of his hand sitting across a rough table and naming a debt that no one had asked him to name. In 22 years, no one with power over her had ever once admitted owing her a single thing. She sat with the strange new shape of it until the window paled toward dawn, and then it was morning. And the morning had teeth, because they all understood, by the time the candle drowned in its own wax, that this could not be a quiet correction. Renauld was 4 days' ride north in the king's own seat, with allies and a seal and a head start. If word reached him that his Hollowpine arrangement had been cracked open, he would not wait to be summoned. He would move first. He would call it loyalty. He would call Garrick's unscheduled detour the sign of a king who had lost his judgment somewhere in the eastern timber, and he would have 9 years of forged reports to wave in the council's faces as proof. So Garrick made the call. "We bring it into the light here," he said. "Today, the whole pack. Every member, full assembly. Before Reynold can write the version of this where I'm the villain and that girl is a liar. Today, Cassius said. With respect, he has people inside these very walls. Pharaoh at the least. We tip our hand in the courtyard. We tip it to them in the same breath. Then we tip it to everyone at once, Garrick answered. A secret kills you. The truth, spoken loud enough, in front of enough witnesses, is the one thing a man like Reynold cannot quietly make disappear. Maren had been silent through all of it. She spoke now. I want to read it. Both men looked at her. The names. The charges. My mother's record. I want to be the one who reads them out. She set her hand flat on the journal's cover. 6 years they made me a thing the eye slides past. If this comes from the king, it's politics. If it comes from me, it's a daughter standing over her mother's grave. She lifted her chin. Let them look at the girl they tied to that post. Let them watch her stand up and name the dead out loud. Garrick studied her a long moment. Then something almost like pride moved behind the gold. It's yours, he said. Read it. The full assembly came in cold and white. Frost had crept across every stone of the courtyard, the same ground where she had knelt 2 nights back. The reckoning stake still standing dead center like a tooth nobody had pulled. She looked at it from the hall window as the pack gathered below. It looked smaller in daylight, less permanent. Everything built to feel eternal has a way of shrinking the moment the truth walks into the yard. Vorn was already in position at the front when she came out. He had dressed formally, his best coat, the pack crest high on the shoulder. By now he understood this was no routine review. His face gave nothing away, but his body carried the set of a man bracing for a wave he can see coming and cannot stop. Sela stood at his side, and the instant Maren appeared at the hall doors, the woman's eyes found her, and for the first time in 6 years, the soft blade smile was nowhere on her face. In its place sat something raw she was failing to cover. Fear. Good. Garrick took the center of the yard. He carried the stillness of the ridge with him, that compressed kind of presence, all of it pointed and none of it loud. Cassius flanked him, the long red line down his forearm still raw beneath the wrapping. The 2 guards held the gates. Every piece set exactly where it needed to be. He spoke without softening anything. No politician's run-up to ease a hard thing down a throat. He spoke plain, the way a man speaks when he believes the people in front of him have a right to know exactly what was done to them. Pack funds redirected over 7 years. Near a third of everything Holopine produced. Provisions that should have filled the bowls of every member, the Omegas whose rations had been cut 3 times in a single year among them, funneled instead into one man's private holdings. He named the manner of it, the forged tribute, the doctored logs. Then he stepped aside, and he handed the courtyard to a girl. Maren walked to the front. Her back screamed under the bandages with every step, and she let none of it reach her face. She stopped beside the reckoning stake. She set her mother's journal open on the flat top of it, on the very post they had bound her to, and she felt the whole pack register what that meant. She read the first name. Then the second. Her voice did not shake. She read what each of them had known, the wound it would have torn, in Vorn's clean accounting. The date each one died, and the lie carved over the death. Fever, a fall, a border patrol that came home 1 wolf short. By the 4th name, the courtyard had stopped breathing as a single body. By the 6th, she read her own mother's name and the word beside it, and she did not break, because she had decided 2 nights ago on her knees that she would never give this ground her breaking again. These are forgeries, Vorn said, his voice cut in, smooth, reaching out for the assembly. This Omega carries a grievance. She has conspired with outsiders too. The records have been authenticated, Garrick said. Cross-checked against Royal Pack archives that predate your leadership by 20 years. The hand has been matched against healer records from 3 separate territories. Iona of Holopine is corroborated on 12 independent points. He let it settle. Try again. And Vorn's composure cracked. Not all the way. The man had too much iron in him for a full collapse. But the fracture showed now, in the set of his jaw, in the half-second, his eyes cut to the gate and found no arithmetic that worked. Vorn of Holopine, Garrick said, by the authority of the AlphaKing of the 7 packs under the Royal Charter, you are removed from leadership. You will answer to the Royal Council for resource theft, for obstruction, and for the deaths of 6-pack members. And that was when Vorn played the card he had been holding all along. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He smiled, the first true thing his face had done all morning. "You invoke a council," he said, "that already knows my name." He looked at Garrick with something almost like pity. "You think you rode in here and surprised me, King. You were sent. You simply don't know yet who holds the other end of your leash." Pharaoh moved on the word. So did 2 guards Maren had never once marked as anything but ordinary men. Steel came out into the cold morning light, and the courtyard, which had held so still, broke open into noise and motion. What came next happened faster than thought. Garrick changed. Not the slow ceremony of a full shift, but the partial one a powerful wolf can throw in a single heartbeat when there's blood in the air, the jaw lengthening, the shoulders rolling massive beneath the coat. He met Pharaoh's blade and turned it aside, and the 2 of them went down into the frost in a tangle of fury and white breath. Cassius took the second man and took a fresh wound for it across the same arm and ignored it the way he ignored most things that inconvenienced him. The guards moved to hold the gates and keep the pack from spilling into the violence, and in the churn of it all, Sella moved. She was fast. Maren had not braced for fast. She came out of the chaos toward Garrick's exposed back with a short blade held low, with the specific desperation of someone who has decided that if it is ending anyway, it will end on her own terms. Maren moved faster. She was not thinking. She knew that much afterward. Whatever had been compressed inside her for 6 years, or for 22, or for the whole of her quiet, careful life, it uncoiled in a single instant and threw her body forward before her mind caught one word of it. She caught Sella's wrist, twisted it the way Bria had drilled into her behind the woodpile years ago, for a fight neither of them had ever truly expected to come. The short blade rang off the courtyard stones. And then Garrick's guards were on Selah, and she was down, and the worst of it was over nearly as fast as it had begun. Maren stood in the middle of the yard, breathing hard, her mother's journal still open on the stake behind her, and she looked at the pack around her. People who had watched her be invisible for 6 years. People who had looked away when she knelt here bleeding into the cold. People who were looking at her now with expressions she had never once in her life been given. Seeing her. Actually seeing her, at last, Aldous stood at the crowd's edge. He met her eyes and inclined his head, once, with a dignity that was its own small ceremony. But it was not finished, because Vorn, restrained now, blood at the corner of his mouth, was still talking, and what he said next froze the courtyard a second time. "Renaud will say, 'The king has gone mad,'" he called out, loud enough for the whole pack to hear it. "He'll say," Garrick abandoned his route on a whim, "that he took the word of a disgraced Omega over a sworn counselor of the realm." He smiled through the blood. "By the time you ride north, King, the story will already be told. And it will not be this one. And here is the thing about a trap. It only works so long as the man inside it doesn't yet know the shape of the door." Cassius stepped forward, blood still running down his arm, and laid the cord-bound packet on the reckoning stake beside the journal. "We have his letters," he said to the assembly and to Vorn both. 9 years of them in Renaud's own hand, under Renaud's own seal. Instructions, payments. A line in the 3rd letter, ordering the healer of Hollowpine silenced before she could send north what she had learned. He looked at Vorn. "You kept his letters as insurance against exactly this morning. You meant to use them to save your own neck. He let that land in the cold air. Instead, they are going to bury him." Maren picked up the topmost letter, and as she did, a folded corner of the journal's back cover caught her thumb. A flap she had never opened. Stitched, not glued. Her mother's own careful work. She worked it loose right there, with hands that had long since learned to be steady. Inside lay a single thin page, folded twice, in plain language again. "If they took my first record, this is the second. The true ledger they never found is buried under the 3rd stone east of Draven's marker. It names every account, every transfer, every man who set his hand to it. Renaud's name is on every page. I could not reach the king in time, but you will. You were always going to. The truth has a longer life than fear, little bird. Make it outlive them all." Maren read it aloud. Her voice carried clean across the frozen yard, and she watched Garrick's face change one final time, because a forged story can drown a man's word. but a buried ledger, dug up in front of 100 witnesses, naming accounts that any clerk in the kingdom can check against the books, is the one weapon a liar 4 days to the north cannot reach across the country to break. Sake riders, Garrick said. To the king's seat. Renaud is to be detained, not warned. He looked at Cassius, then at the pack, then at the girl beside the post. We do not ride north chasing his version of this. We arrive carrying ours. In her hand, in her mother's hand, in the very ground itself. They found the ledger where Iona had said it would be. Under the third stone east of a dead man's marker, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp of the years it had lain there. Maren dug the last of the dirt away herself, on her knees in the cold ground, and this time the kneeling meant something else entirely. This time she chose it. The rest moved the way these things move once the secret is out, and the witnesses are many. Renaud was taken at the king's seat before the riders carrying his version of events ever reached him, because the truth had ridden faster and louder, and with far better proof in its saddlebags. Vorn and Sella and Faro went into royal custody to wait on a trial that would be neither quiet nor brief. 6 families were told, formally and to their faces, that the people they had buried under the word fever and the word accident had in truth been buried under a lie. There was a ceremony for the dead. Maren stood at the front of it, because someone had to, and because her mother's name was on the list, and because standing in that courtyard without shaking felt like the thing Iona would have asked of her. She did not shake. Hollowpine began the slow, ugly work of becoming something other than what it had been. New interim leadership, drawn from the senior members who had been too frightened to speak for 7 years, and who now spoke with the dazed energy of people freed from a cage they had stopped believing was a cage at all. There were setbacks, old habits surfacing, but there was movement, and movement in the right direction is its own kind of grace. The question of Maren's blood took longer to settle than the trials did. Old laws, complicated ones, days of formal council deliberation she stayed at the edge of, because that particular truth needed hands that understood the machinery of power better than hers did yet. But Garrick kept her told. Every session, every turn of it. And one morning, the first truly warm one of a late and stubborn spring, he asked whether she wanted a ceremony of her own, official recognition, her name, her standing, her line, written at last into the records of the 7 packs. What would my name be? She asked. Maren of the royal house, daughter of Iona. Blood of the ruling line. She thought about it a moment. It would mean people know who I am. Yes. It would mean I could never go back to being invisible. No, he agreed. You could not, good, she said. I don't want to be invisible anymore. So she stood in the courtyard of Hollowpine with the spring light coming down gold over the walls and the whole pack assembled, Bria beside her in the good blue dress she'd been saving for something that mattered. She stood at the center of the ground where she had once knelt, where her mother's journal had rested on the stake, and she heard her own name spoken in its full truth for the first time in her life. After the formal words, after Cassius read out the council's document, after the record was amended and witnessed, Garrick did a thing that was in no protocol anywhere. He reached out and took her hand, not as authority, as one person holding the hand of another in the light. You were never what they made you, he said quietly, her mother's exact words, from a letter he had never read, arriving now from a different road and a different mouth. Her throat went tight. I know, she said. I know you do. I'm saying it anyway, Bria. To her right, made a sound that was unmistakably crying dressed up as a cough, and Maren would tease her about it for years to come. What happens now? Maren asked him. He considered the question the way he considered everything fully. Now, you decide. You have standing, resources, the protection of the crown, your mother's knowledge, and the whole record of what was done here. You do with all of it whatever you choose. What would you choose? She asked. If you were me, he was quiet a moment. I'd stay, he said. I'd learn what I needed to learn. I'd help rebuild what was broken in this place. And I'd make certain that what happened to Iona, to all 6 of them, never happened in any pack of mine again. And then, he said, and something in his voice was just a man now, not a king, I would want to see what comes next. She squeezed the hand of the king who had heard her silence from a ridge in the dark and come down before the sun. All right, she said. Let's see what comes next. The reckoning stake came down that summer. Maren asked for it herself. They pulled 300 years of iron out of the stone. And the ground beneath was pale where the sun had never once touched it, and someone planted something there. I am told it grew, and Maren, daughter of Iona, blood of the royal line, the woman they were so certain they had broken, lifted her face to the warm light and stood in the center of it, whole, unhidden, seen, at last. Now let me stop here a moment, before you go. Because this is the part of the story that was never really about wolves at all. I've spent my whole long life around men who confused volume with strength, men who believed the loudest voice in the room was the strongest one in it. And I'll tell you what this story taught me, late, the way the best lessons always seem to come. The strongest thing Maren ever did was go quiet, think on that. They expected her to scream, because a scream is a kind of surrender. A scream says you've reached me, you've found the bottom of me. And when she went silent on that 10th lash, she wasn't broken. She was holding the one thing they could not take. People will spend years trying to make you small. They'll hand you a name and a corner and a story about yourself. And the cruelest part of it is that it works, because you begin to believe it's true. Maren believed it for 6 years. And then, one cold night, she didn't. Here's what I've come to know, and I'm old enough now to say it plain. No one gets to decide your worth by where they force you to stand. They tied a girl to a post and called her nothing. And she was the highest blood in the kingdom the entire time, kneeling there in the dark. We don't always know what's standing right in front of us. We see the uniform, the job, the bad luck, the quiet one in the corner, and we write off the whole person in a single careless glance. It makes you wonder how many people each of us has walked straight past. How many we decided were small, when the truth was only buried somewhere we never thought to look. And there's a second thing, just as important as the first. Maren did not survive alone. There was Bria, who sat down beside a starving stranger and offered food and asked for nothing. There was an old man who carried a key and a secret far too long and found his courage at the very end. There was a king who turned Faz Road because something in the dark was wrong, and he would not let himself ride past it. Not one of them could have fixed it alone. But each of them came down off their own mountain when it counted. That is the whole of it. That is the entire lesson. When you hear someone go quiet, when you feel a wrongness in the wind, and it would be so much easier to keep riding on toward dinner and a warm bed, the real measure of you is whether you turn toward it. The truth has a longer life than fear. Maren's mother bet her own life on those words, and she was right. Fear is loud and it is fast and it wins the afternoon. But the truth is patient. It will lie in the ground under a stone and wait years for the right hands to come. So let me ask you, the way I've been asking myself ever since I first carried this story home. Have you ever been judged by people who never once bothered to learn your story? Have you been the quiet one in the corner that everybody underestimated and then proved them all wrong? Or have you been the one who very nearly rode past and turned back just in time? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one of them, I promise you that. And tell me where you're listening from tonight and what the hour is in your part of the world, because there is something to me about the thought of all of us, scattered everywhere across the map, sitting with the same old story at the same strange hours of the night. Stay a while. Tell me where you are, and I'll see you in the next one.